In September 1988, a wire service reporter confirmed a detail that should not have been news at all. The police commissioner of the largest city in America was personally carrying a pistol his own department had banned 2 years earlier. The New York City Police Department, 35,000 officers strong, had prohibited its officers from carrying the weapon in 1986, on the theory that its polymer construction might let it slip past an airport metal detector undetected. It was not a fringe worry inside the department. It was official policy, taken seriously enough to keep the pistol out of 35,000 holsters. It was also wrong. The pistol carried more than a pound of steel in its slide, barrel, and internal components. And it had already registered clearly on every screening machine ever tested against it before the ban was even written. Commissioner Benjamin Ward knew that. He had been carrying one anyway. When the Associated Press confirmed it, a deputy commissioner had to publicly admit within a day that the department's own leadership had already made a decision its own policy said it should not have been allowed to make. That is not really a story about a metal detector. It is the first crack in the real question this documentary is built around. How does a professional whose entire job is to distrust things, an instructor, an armorer, a chief, a city council member, come to trust a piece of equipment enough to bet a life on it? Not his own life. Somebody else's on a street corner at 2 a.m. in a decision made in less than a second. That question runs through every chapter that follows, and by the end it will not be about a pistol at all. It will be about what an entire American profession learned about how trust actually gets built. And it starts, of all places, in a hallway outside the Austrian Ministry of Defense, with a man nobody in that hallway had any reason to believe. Deutschwagram is a town of a few thousand people on the flat agricultural plain northeast of Vienna, the kind of place most Austrians outside the region could not place on a map. In 1963, in a garage there, a 52-year-old man and his wife ran a small manufacturing operation producing curtain rods and window fittings. His name was Gaston Glock. He was the son of a railway worker. There was no inherited workshop behind him, no family gunsmithing line stretching back generations the way there was for the engineers at Fabrique Nationale or the sons of Obendorf. In the final months of the Second World War, the Wehrmacht had conscripted him as a teenager, and the war had ended before he saw anything resembling real combat. He came home to a country being rebuilt out of rubble, finished an engineering education, and took a job at a manufacturer of hand drills, where he spent years learning something that would end up mattering more than any firearms training ever could have. He learned materials, not as theory, but as the discipline of a man whose customer's product would fail in the field if a tolerance was off by a fraction of a millimeter. He learned what happens to metal and, more importantly, to polymer under thousands of repeated cycles of stress, the same motion again and again until something finally gives, or does not. Through the 1970s, the garage operation grew into a real supplier to the Austrian military, though nothing about the contracts was glamorous. Field knives, entrenching tools, training grenades, cartridge belt links. Each one taught Glock something specific about what a defense ministry actually valued, which had nothing to do with elegance or brand heritage and everything to do with durability under abuse, simplicity a conscript could operate without training, and a price that would not embarrass a peacetime budget officer. In 1980, Glock bought an injection molding machine to produce polymer components for the knives he already supplied, and when he started hiring engineers for the work, he did not hire gunsmiths. He hired people out of the camera industry, precision technicians who thought in fractions of a millimeter applied to synthetic materials that the entire firearms world still considered fit only for toys. He was in a Ministry of Defense corridor on ordinary business, there about his existing supply contracts, when he overheard two officers discussing a problem. The Austrian Army's standard sidearm, a Walther P-38, designed before the war Glock himself had been conscripted into, was aging out, and the ministry had just circulated a specification of 17 requirements to every established manufacturer in Europe. A list so demanding that some of the continent's most respected gunmakers would need months just to draft a serious response. Glock introduced himself. He said his company could build it. The officers were polite. They were also, by every account of the moment, completely unconvinced, and they had every reason to be. A curtain rod manufacturer does not become a service pistol manufacturer because he says so in a hallway. What made that hallway conversation matter at all was something specifically Austrian, and it deserves its own beat, because without it, this entire story stops before it starts. Austria is a small country. Its Ministry of Defense in 1980 was not an ocean of layered committees insulated from outside proposals the way a larger nation's defense bureaucracy might have been. It was compact enough that a persistent supplier with an unconventional pitch could still end up in front of the right desk within weeks rather than years. The 17 requirements themselves reflected the same national character, uncompromising and entirely unsentimental about tradition. The pistol had to fire the NATO standard 9-memory round. It had to survive being dropped onto a steel plate without discharging. It had to function after being frozen, after being buried in sand, after enduring heat past 100 degrees Celsius. It had to weigh under 28 ounces, contain no more than 40 parts, fire 15,000 rounds, and then survive an overpressure cartridge generating nearly double the standard chamber pressure. Austria was not asking anyone to submit a good pistol. It was asking someone to prove, mechanically and in public, that trust could be earned rather than simply assumed because of a name on the slide. Every established manufacturer that received those 17 requirements began from the same place, their own existing catalog. Heckler & Koch submitted variants of its P7 and P9. Sig Sauer offered the P220 and P226. Beretta entered a version of its 92. Finn Herstal proposed an updated Browning High Power, a design already older than most of the engineers refining it. Steyr Mannlicher, Austria's own national arms company, entered its GB. Every one of these submissions was an evolution of an architecture its manufacturer had already staked years of institutional identity on. And every one of them held a belief that Glock simply did not share, because he had never been trained to hold it, that a serious combat pistol had to be built from steel. Polymer had been tried once before, in Heckler & Koch's own VP-70 back in 1970, and it had gone essentially nowhere. That was not stubbornness on the established industry's part. It was experience. Polymer had already failed once, publicly, inside a company that genuinely knew what it was doing. Why would a curtain rod manufacturer with no firearms pedigree at all succeed where Heckler & Koch had not? Glock did not argue with any of it. He went and bought his rival's pistols instead, a Beretta 92, a Sig Sauer P220, a CZ75, a modern Walther, and brought them back to his own workshop to take apart, studying where each design carried real strength, and where it was carrying weight that had nothing to do with function and everything to do with 100 years of unexamined assumption about what a pistol was supposed to look like. He assembled a team that had almost nothing in common with a traditional arms company's engineering staff, military officers, police firearms instructors, competitive shooters, and 2 engineers who had actually worked on Heckler and Koch's own VP-70 and P-9 programs, brought in specifically because they understood exactly where that earlier polymer attempt had gone wrong. Picture the room where he put the question to them, because it is the moment the whole company's philosophy gets born in real time. If you could design a combat pistol from nothing, with no factory tooling to protect and no reputation to defend, what would it look like? The answers converged fast. Higher capacity, fewer parts, lighter weight, a trigger that behaved identically on every single shot, so an officer or a soldier never had to remember what state the weapon was in. That question, and the answer it produced, is where the company's defining philosophy actually lived. Long before anyone wrote it down, every part that does not need to exist is a part that can fail, jam, or be lost by a frightened person in the dark. It is worth saying once, plainly, because it is the idea that governs every decision the company would make for the next 4 decades, and it did not arrive without a fight inside Glock's own workshop first. The fight was over the external safety, and it is the first real conflict in this story, not a manufactured one. Every established combat pistol on the market carried some form of manual safety lever, decocking mechanism, or double-action first pull, because the entire industry had built its training doctrine around the assumption that an operator needed a deliberate physical step between holding a loaded weapon and firing it. Some of Glock's own engineers worried that eliminating that step entirely, relying instead on 3 passive internal mechanisms that engaged and disengaged automatically with the trigger itself, would look reckless rather than elegant to a conservative military evaluator. Glock held the line himself. The external safety, he argued, was not a safeguard. It was a decision point, and every decision point under stress was a place where a trained person could make a fatal mistake. Removing it did not remove safety from the weapon. It removed the moment where safety depended on a human being remembering something correctly in the worst 5 seconds of his life. That is not a small design choice. It is a philosophical bet against the entire prevailing wisdom of an industry, made by a man whose only real credential was 2 decades spent learning what materials actually do under stress. The prototype came together in roughly 3 months, an almost absurd timeline for a first-time designer building an entirely new operating system from a cold start. And it very nearly did not survive its own internal testing. In the early development trials at Glock's own facility, the team ran into a problem nobody had fully anticipated. At the temperature extremes the Austrian protocol would eventually demand, the polymer compound's behavior under stress needed further refinement before anyone could trust it to hold its dimensions the way steel naturally did. It was, in a company that would soon be defined entirely by its reliability, the one moment where the material at the center of the whole idea threatened to undo it before a single Austrian officer had ever seen it fire. The team reworked the compound. They tested it again. It held. That quiet, unglamorous correction, made inside a small Austrian workshop with no press release attached to it, is the specific reason the rest of this story gets to happen at all. In early 1982, sample pistols reached the Austrian army for the trial that would decide whether any of it mattered. The protocol was among the harshest in NATO, frozen to -40, heated past 100 degrees Celsius, dropped onto steel plates, buried in sand, submerged in water, caked in mud, fired continuously until barrels glowed, then subjected to an overpressure cartridge, generating nearly double the standard chamber pressure, then fired for 15,000 rounds and inspected for wear. This is the moment every established rival in that trial fully expected the curtain rod maker to fail, because everything they knew about polymer told them it would crack, warp, or simply come apart the way the VP-70 experiment had a decade earlier. Picture the room itself for a second. Engineers from 5 of Europe's most storied gun makers, standing at the edge of a testing rig, watching a pistol get pulled, dripping from sand and salt water, and function on the first pull exactly as it had on the last. It did not fail. Friedrich Deschamps, who headed Austria's own armaments and defense technology agency, said afterward, without qualification, that the design was clearly superior to everything else submitted. It had outperformed 8 pistols from 5 manufacturers whose combined institutional history and firearms design ran into centuries. Austria adopted it in 1982 as the Pistol 80. The Austrian police followed. Every rival in that room had believed, with good reason, that this could not happen. It happened anyway, in front of them, and there was no appeal. None of that guaranteed anything on the other side of the Atlantic, where an entirely different kind of institution, one that had never heard of Deschamps' trial and would not have cared much if it had, was about to decide the pistol's real and much harder fate. By the mid-1980s, American urban policing had a problem that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with arithmetic. The cocaine trade had put semi-automatic pistols into the hands of street-level dealers faster than any prior era of American crime had prepared departments for. Weapons like the Tech-9, carrying 32 rounds of 9 memory in a single magazine, reloadable in seconds. The standard American police sidearm was still a 6-shot revolver, typically a Smith & Wesson Model 10, reliable and simple, and by 1985, arithmetically outmatched in a way every police executive in a major city understood without needing a memo to explain it. An officer who has to reload 3 times as often as the person shooting at him is not undertrained. He is losing a fight that marksmanship cannot fix. Departments went looking for semi-automatics, and the candidates already on the table were not obscure. Smith & Wesson had its own line of double-action pistols. Beretta had the 92, on its way to becoming the American military's own M9. These were credible weapons from credible manufacturers carrying the same century of institutional trust that had made the Austrian trial's steel-framed rivals feel unbeatable on paper. And they carried a flaw those rivals had never had reason to examine, because a battlefield trial and a police academy measure reliability against entirely different failure points. Picture a recruit on an academy range on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, 22 years old, having fired perhaps 40 rounds of live ammunition in his entire life before that week, about to be handed a duty weapon he will be expected to trust completely within a fraction of a second, on a street corner, in the dark, in a moment he did not choose and cannot rehearse. The double-action pistols of the era demanded that this recruit remember, under exactly that kind of pressure, which mode the weapon was in, a long, heavy first pull or a lighter one after. An officer who forgot did not simply miss. He hesitated, or he yanked a trigger, braced for one resistance, and got another, and in the half-second that confusion cost him, an entire encounter could turn. This was not a hypothetical raised by gun magazine writers. It was a documented concern inside firearms training units and shooting review boards, because trigger transition error was, specifically, the single most common cause of preventable mistakes instructors were watching happen on their own ranges. Into that exact gap walked an American sales representative named Carl Walter. And what he understood, better than any executive at Smith & Wesson or Beretta, was that American police procurement is not one decision. It is hundreds of independent municipal budgets, each one controlled by a chief who answers to a city council that does not want to spend money it does not have to spend. And every one of those decisions shaped less by a corporate sales pitch than by what the firearms instructor down the road happened to be saying at the coffee machine that week. Walter was not a salesman in the way the industry understood the word. He was a strategist who had studied the actual mechanics of how a department changes its mind, and he built his entire approach around a single insight. A chief does not care about a European military trial report. A chief cares about liability exposure and political risk. An instructor does not care about a spec sheet. An instructor cares about how fast a nervous recruit reaches a safe, accurate standard. An armorer does not care about marketing language. An armorer cares about how many parts can break and how quickly a bench inspection can confirm the gun is still sound. He faced real resistance before he faced any success, and it is worth naming honestly, because a story with no obstacle in it is not a true one. Steel loyalty ran deep inside American law enforcement armories, reinforced by decades of institutional habit and by a specific recent memory that was not unreasonable at all. Heckler & Koch had already tried a polymer service pistol once, and it had failed to gain any real traction. To a skeptical armorer in 1985, that was not ancient history. That was proof the idea had already been tested by a serious company and had already come up short. Beretta, SIG, and Smith & Wesson were not simply complacent incumbents standing in the way. They were companies with every rational reason, based on the industry's own recent past, to believe the argument had already been settled in Steel's favor. Walter's task, then, was not selling a better product into an open market. It was overturning a specific, reasonable institutional memory, and he did it by removing every form of risk a department could name. A department trading in worn revolvers received brand new Glocks, holsters, and free armorer certification, in many cases at no cost at all, because a polymer frame produced by injection molding cost a fraction of what machining a steel frame required, and Glock could profit from reselling the surrendered revolvers on the secondary market even after giving the new pistols away for free. No steel frame competitor could match that arithmetic without losing money on every single unit. And rather than requiring an agency's own instructors to travel to a corporate academy, the way established manufacturers did, Walter sent Glock's own instructors directly to the department, on the company's schedule, at the company's expense. Picture a training day at a mid-sized department's outdoor range. A Glock certified instructor running a captain and a dozen patrol officers through their first qualification course, while two firearms instructors from a neighboring jurisdiction stand at the edge of the berm out of pure professional curiosity, watching how fast the recruits' groups tighten. Those two instructors go home and describe exactly what they saw, in the specific technical language firearms professionals use with each other, not in a brochure. That is how trust actually spreads inside a profession trained to doubt almost everything on the first telling, sideways, from one skeptical expert to another, at the edge of a range that was never designed to be a sales floor. City councils argued over all of it anyway. and they were right to. Handing over a department's entire sidearm inventory to a foreign manufacturer nobody in the room had heard of 18 months earlier was not a decision any procurement board took lightly. In more than one department, the debate ran for months. Chiefs weighing officer safety against political optics, council members wary of a headline calling the switch reckless, armorers quietly uneasy about a maintenance system they did not yet understand. What actually tipped those rooms was never the pitch alone. It was the accumulating, sideways evidence, one instructor and one armorer and one qualification score at a time, until the argument against switching had nothing left standing behind it. Every professional inside that ecosystem trusted the pistol for a different reason, and naming each one specifically matters, because collapsing them into a single explanation misses what actually happened. The chief trusted it because it lowered his department's liability exposure. In officer-involved shootings, where trigger transition error had previously been a factor a plaintiff's attorney could exploit in court. The armorer trusted it because 34 parts laid out on a bench and counted meant a smaller spares inventory and a shorter inspection checklist across an entire fleet of duty weapons maintained on a budget that never grew. The instructor trusted it because recruits reached qualification standard in less range time, on the same calendar and the same ammunition budget that had never once been generous. The individual officer trusted it because his own hands, on his own worst night, did not have to remember anything except to point and pull. And the city council trusted it, in the end, for the coldest and most honest reason of all: it cost nothing. And it could be defended in a public budget hearing in a single sentence. 5 separate trusts, 5 separate audiences, and a company that had never built a firearm before 1980 had built a pistol, and a distribution strategy that answered every one of them at once, without ever writing a single sentence of the argument down. The turning point where private, department by department trust became something much larger happened, almost by accident, inside the largest police department in the country. That is the band this documentary opened with, and it is worth returning to now with the full weight of everything that came before it. In early 1986, the NIP banned the Glock on the theory that its polymer body might slip past an airport metal detector. It was a real, formal position, not a rumor confined to one precinct, and it kept the pistol out of holsters across the largest force in America for 2 years. In September 1988, the Associated Press reported that Commissioner Benjamin Ward was personally carrying one. A deputy commissioner confirmed publicly, within a day, that the pistol was fully detectable by existing screening equipment, and that the department's own leadership had already trusted it enough to carry it. The ban collapsed almost as fast as it had been written. Within months, narcotics detectives and organized crime investigators across the department were carrying it openly. There is a real difference between what happened before that reversal and what happened after it, and the difference has a name worth stating plainly. Before September 1988, individual departments trusted the Glock. That is trust. A specific instructor, a specific armorer, a specific chief, each independently persuaded by evidence he had personally verified on his own range. After September 1988, something larger took over. Departments that had never run their own trial, never hosted a Glock training day, never counted the 34 parts themselves, adopted the pistol anyway, because the largest, most scrutinized department in the country had just very publicly reversed itself in the pistol's favor. That is reputation. The point where an institution no longer needs its own evidence because enough other institutions it already respects have supplied it for them. Trust is earned one skeptical professional at a time. Reputation is what trust becomes once it has been earned often enough that the next department no longer has to start from zero. By the end of the 1990s, an estimated 65% of American law enforcement agencies carried Glock pistols. When a competitor publicly challenged that number as inflated, the company answered with the same instinct that had built it in the first place. It commissioned an exhaustive audit of every law enforcement agency in the country, broken down by region, to establish the truth rather than argue about an estimate. The audit came back higher than the disputed figure, not lower. 74% nationally, above 90% in some regions. A company that had built curtain rods 8 years before its first firearms trial had armed roughly 3 out of every 4 police officers in the United States. And when a rival accused it of exaggerating, its own investigation proved it had been understating the truth. A company defending its reputation with a spreadsheet is doing something categorically different from a company defending it with a slogan, and professionals trained to distrust everything can tell the difference immediately. The proof that let all of this survive decades of skeptical scrutiny came from entirely outside the company, and it needed to, because a manufacturer's own reliability claims are worth nothing to a profession trained to doubt self-reported anything. Chuck Taylor, a Vietnam-era Army Special Forces veteran turned independent firearms instructor, bought a Glock 17 in 1988 with the specific intention of finding where it broke. He fired 10,000 rounds through it without cleaning it once. Nothing happened. He kept going, past 100,000 rounds, past 200,000, somewhere beyond 325,000 rounds of sustained, uncleaned fire. A trigger spring finally gave out, the single documented mechanical failure in the entire test. He replaced the spring on the spot and kept shooting. He took the same pistol to Alaska and fired it at 40 degrees below zero. He sealed it and left it on the ocean floor in salt water for 6 months, retrieved it, fired 10 magazines through it with no preparation at all, and it ran. That one broken trigger spring, buried inside an otherwise unbroken 250,000 round test, matters more to this story than a flawless result would have. A test with no failure reads like a manufacturer's own marketing claim. A test with exactly one documented failure, promptly explained and immediately resolved, reads like the truth. The sharpest edge of that proof came from the pistol the American military had chosen instead. The Beretta 92, adopted over the Glock years earlier through a process weighted as much by institutional momentum as by evidence, documented locking block failures and slide fractures during Gulf War deployments. Precisely in the sand and heat conditions a duty sidearm exists to survive without complaint. American Special Operations Units, largely outside the conventional procurement chain that had passed on the Glock the first time around, ran their own trials under their own conditions and reached their own conclusions. Army Rangers adopted the compact Glock 19. Marine Corps Forces Special Operations Command adopted the Glock 19. Delta Force adopted the Glock 22. These were not units persuaded by a reputation built somewhere else. They were the most skeptical evaluators in American military culture, and they arrived, on their own evidence, at the same conclusion patrol departments had reached a decade earlier from a completely different direction, by a completely different chain of trust, military engineers first, then police instructors, then armorers, then chiefs, then city councils, then whole departments, and finally an entire industry that had no choice left but to follow. The industry's reaction was not gradual. It was total, and it deserves to be seen as the institutional humiliation it actually was, rather than a simple footnote about market copying. Within roughly a decade of the Glock 17 reaching American shelves, every major manufacturer that wanted a share of the police and civilian concealed carry market was retooling for its own polymer-framed, striker-fired pistol. Smith & Wesson, the very company whose revolvers Glock's own trade and program had been quietly hauling out of patrol cars for years, introduced the M&P. Springfield Armory introduced the XD. Sig Sauer eventually followed with the polymer-framed P320, decades after its steel-framed P226 had been a serious contender in the very trials the Glock had swept in Austria. Heckler & Koch, whose own VP-70 experiment in 1970 had been the industry's first and, for a decade, its last word on the subject, came back with the VP-9. Companies with a century of steel-framed pedigree behind their names spent millions retraining engineers who had built entire careers machining steel, retooling factories for injection molding they had never needed before, and asking their oldest, most loyal customers to trust a plastic pistol from a firm that had spent generations building the opposite argument. The industry that had once dismissed a curtain rod manufacturer's entry as a novelty was, within 15 years, entirely defined by having copied it. Gaston Glock never disappeared from his own company the way founders sometimes do once a product outgrows them. He ran Glock GmbH personally for decades, refusing outside investors, refusing a public listing, refusing the quarterly earnings pressure that had hollowed out or bankrupted so many older, more storied American gunmakers by the century's end. In July 1999, that personal control very nearly cost him his life. He discovered that a trusted financial advisor had been embezzling millions from the company. When Glock confronted him, the advisor hired a mercenary to kill him in an underground parking garage using a rubber mallet in an attack designed to look like an accident. Glock was 70 years old. He was struck repeatedly in the head. He fought back and he knocked his attacker unconscious with his own hands before help arrived. He recovered and he went back to running the company. There is something almost unbearably literal in that single night. A man who had spent 2 decades building a reputation for surviving abuse that would destroy anything else, absorbing a real physical attempt on his own life, and simply refusing to be the exception to the standard he had built his entire company around. More than 20 million Glock pistols have been manufactured since 1982, refined across 6 generations without a single change to the underlying architecture. And in 2020, a Glock 17 variant won the French military's own service pistol trials outright, beating designs the French had specifically evaluated against it. The arithmetic that opened this story, one side reloading 3 times as often as the other, never changed. What changed was which side of that arithmetic the professionals sworn to protect other people were willing to bet their own trust on, and how far down the chain that trust had to travel before it stopped needing to be proven from scratch. What actually happened here is not the story of an outsider tricking an industry into a mistake it would later regret, and telling it that way would flatten the whole thing. What happened is more demanding and more interesting than that. A curtain rod manufacturer's philosophical bet against unnecessary complexity was tested by a small country's uncompromising procurement culture. Argued over inside his own workshop before it ever left the building, proven publicly in front of the exact institutions built to distrust it and carried into daily use by chiefs, instructors, armorers, and officers who each demanded their own separate piece of evidence before they staked anything on it. Every duty pistol designed after the mid-1990s, regardless of manufacturer, was measured against a standard that had not existed before that Austrian workshop produced it. A trigger that behaved the same on every shot, a parts count an armorer could service without a specialist, and a fire control system that asked nothing of an officer's memory in the 1 second that mattered most. Procurement boards that had once evaluated pistols on cost and brand reputation alone began writing trigger consistency and parts count directly into their own specifications. The same 17 requirements Austria had once handed to 5 skeptical manufacturers, now handed down again by American cities to an industry that had learned the lesson the hard way. The expectation did not belong to one company anymore. It belonged to the entire profession. Somewhere tonight, in a patrol car idling at the edge of a quiet lot, there is a duty holster carrying a mechanism that has not fundamentally changed since 2 officers in a Ministry of Defense corridor looked at a curtain rod manufacturer in 1980 and did not believe a single word he told them. He built it anyway. Everyone else spent the next 40 years catching up to a decision he had already made. One instructor, one armorer, one department at a time, that the only thing worth trusting completely is the thing with nothing left inside it to fail.